And we're live. Yep.
Good morning. Good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, where we're going to talk about some of the key barriers that we identified during our project on behalf of Renew, which was funded by the ECA, investigating consumer-focused futures. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We will be recording this session so that we can make it available, and everybody on this webinar will be able to get a copy of that. Um, the other thing to announce is that at the end of this, we'll be doing a Q&A, and the I guess the final thing I just mention is the title of this is: Are we sending a network? Are we sending electricity networks the wrong incentives for the wrong behavior? And that will be what we get to at the end. But we'll go through a little bit of a journey here, just to remind folks who weren't at our last webinar of the work that we did optimizing what a consumer-focused future might look like, and then diving into some of the barriers we identified as part of that project. Okay, so with that, I will get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ezra Beeman. I'm Managing Director of Energeia. We've got offices in Sydney, Australia, and California, and we tend to specialize in techno-economic analysis. So let's move on to the next slide. So in terms of the presentation today, first of all, we'll talk about the project key drivers and objectives, some of the cost benefit assessment results. Now, this was covered in detail in the last webinar, and if you haven't seen that, I do encourage you to go and go through that webinar as well. There's also the opportunity to access the presentation. So I'm not going to go over it in as much detail this time, but really where we're going to spend our time is what were some of the key barriers and potential solutions that we saw to those barriers as part of that work. And then we'll do a bit of a Q&A. Now, these webinars are designed to be relatively short. And so I'm expecting about 30 minutes of content and then maybe 15 minutes of Q&A. And again, thank you for your attendance. So, as I mentioned, we were engaged as part of a project, and this was really the second phase of the project. The first phase of the project looked at what the relative costs and benefits of different solutions to DER-driven impacts onto the grid and to the power system. And during that time, even though we were looking very much at the low voltage network and the opportunities for behind the meter resources to provide services, as well as the existing sort of traditional services that were available, it was identified that you can't really just look at the LV networks in isolation, because some of these resources can also be used elsewhere in the system when they're not being used to for example, help manage voltage rise. And so it was important to look at whole of system impacts, cost and benefits of behind the meter solutions, and in particular, the wholesale market. So in stage 2, which we completed towards the end of last year, we looked to analyze a consumer-focused scenario, one that was actually much more I guess, aggressive in what could be done behind the meter compared to even the step change scenario or high DER scenario that you might see in the ISP. And to identify, well, if we could unlock economically efficient levels of behind the meter resources, which by the way, were actually lower in many cases, particularly over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, what would that mean in terms of overall cost savings on a whole of system basis? And then what were some of the key barriers and solutions that would need to be addressed to unlock those benefits? So what did we find? Now, we looked at this on a 15-year basis and on a 30-year basis, and we looked across the value chain. Now, what we're showing you here is the net benefits or net benefits compared to the AMO step change scenario. And the key things that varied in this modeling were not EV uptake or building electrification, but rather the rate of uptake of solar PV in the behind the meter storage. So the way that this scenario was constructed was to look every year, given wholesale market dynamics and the level of peak demand in the network and how much that network cost to augment, what was the optimal level of solar and storage that could be adopted by consumers. And it started off very low, like 2 kilowatts of solar, 0 kilowatts of batteries. And only as the price fell did we actually see more of that resource get added. And so that's why there's actually not a huge amount of difference between the two scenarios, because most of the costs are backloaded and in the outer years. But those resources, when they were implemented, they were fully realized in terms of their potential to be applied to manage peak demand, to manage even exports, and thereby reduce potential network capex compared to if they weren't available. And then in the wholesale market, they were used to mainly defer um, additional generation or wholesale market batteries from coming online. And then we also looked at the different impacts for having potentially more solar than otherwise would be the case, which wasn't a huge impact there. And on a 15-year basis, the simulation found about a $25 billion savings compared to the AMO step change scenario. And over a 30-year basis, it was as high as 69 billion, and that's in net present value dollars. So that's what we covered in the last webinar. I just wanted to bring everybody up to that same level of understanding about really what are we playing for here? Why should we investigate and ultimately try and unlock these benefits? Well, this is saying there's about 25 billion at stake for consumers, and longer term, it's about 70 billion. So when we looked at some of the potential barriers here, we broke them out into 4 different categories. One was just the signals that are being sent, and this speaks to allocative efficiency. Now, economists describe a number of different levels of efficiency. Some may be more familiar with productive efficiency, and that's really a measure of what the cost of the inputs are relative to the outputs. Now, there's another kind of efficiency, which is allocative efficiency, and that's essentially how accurate the prices of things are, and it's got a technical definition of marginal revenue being set equal to marginal cost, and that can be problematic in a regulated utility. But I think in layman's terms, it's really about making sure that the price signals are accurate. Because if you don't have an accurate understanding of how much something costs, then you're either going to over or under consume it. And that's one of the key challenges that faces the industry for a number of reasons. So we'll talk a little bit about how those signals could be improved. The other area that we looked at is what we're calling leveling the playing field, and that's just potentially some um, implicit biases or barriers in the way things are done today, compared to how they might be done when behind the meter resources were fully engaged in the delivery of services for this industry. And then under enablement, we'll talk briefly about just some of the techniques and systems and capabilities that we see in best practice areas around the world, and particularly in the U.S., that are going to be essential for the industry to put in place if we are to achieve that net savings that we identified. And finally, just the incentives that are out there. Both in terms of the regulatory incentives and the investor incentives, and that was really the key focus of the blog that we issued earlier this month. So one of the key things we identified as part of this work was just how variable the definition of long-run marginal cost was. And the long-run marginal cost is an important concept for a number of reasons in economics, but in the case of pricing and under the rules, networks have to set prices, peak prices or prices during the congestion or peak period, equal to recover their long-run marginal costs. And so ensuring that these long-run marginal costs are accurate is really important to that end. And what we found when we looked at how different networks were calculating their long-run marginal costs, we saw just a lot of variability. Now, not everyone necessarily has to do things the same way, but this variability could be indicative of perhaps the need for more standardization around what needs to be included in the calculation of long-run marginal cost. Under the rules, there are requirements that the costs need to recover all long-term costs, and that the long-term is defined as the period over which all fixed costs become variable, which has prompted me at times to think, well, doesn't that mean that it should include 100% of all of these costs, or at least those costs that are driven by peak demand? And yet we don't really see that in this analysis, nor do we see a consistent treatment of how much OPEX should you include in here that's related to the CapEx. So as an example, we looked at if you were to include 100% of OGX and maybe 50% of RepEx, and how does that compare to what we're seeing out there in the market? And so what we found was it would actually result in long-run marginal costs that were nearly double, and in some cases quintuple what we're seeing out there in the market. And so one of the fundamental things that has to be done well for efficiency to be realized under the economic precept of allocative efficiency is that we have to get these numbers right. And we need to put more effort into this, because if they're wrong, we're sending all the wrong signals within the networks and outside the networks as to the value of alternative non-network alternatives. The other thing is, my experience in working in this industry is that there's very little data currently available, and so an investment in a better understanding about how much each area of the network and the various assets is going to be important, so that network planners, network engineers are better able to really make the appropriate trade-offs. And it didn't used to matter before, because there really wasn't a lot of alternatives. We did some energy efficiency projects. Maybe there's a little bit of demand response. Moving forward, there's a whole lot of batteries and solar, and in the future maybe fuel cells. And so getting this number right is really super important. So the other issue associated with price signaling and value signaling is the time over which, the time during which we say it's going to be a congestion congestion period. And again, this is required under the rules that the peak period should be set at the time when the incremental consumption is likely to drive in the long term additional investment and cost. And so as an example here, we're showing when zone subs, what we did is we looked at all the zone subs in a particular network, and we identified when on average those zone subs were within 10% of the annual peak. And given the uncertainty in the modeling and given weather, that's not a bad indicator of when additional demand could generate a future peak. And you can see in this particular network's example that that's really concentrated here between January and February. And I think in this case, we did weather normalization. We also did a trending for a 5-year period. So it's a very forward-looking weather normalized view, but it's very data driven. And yet when we compared it to the actual peak periods of the rate structure, which drives people's benefits and return on investment from their distributed energy resources, we see that you've got a peak period between November and March, and then a shoulder period, and then another peak period at another time. So at least in this case, when we looked at it, the actual time of use periods that are being signaled to potential investors and behind the meter resources is totally different than the reality that we saw in this particular case. And I would recognize that under the rules, it's also important that the rates be human readable. I think that's a particular element of the rules that maybe should be looked at again, because increasingly it's going to be robots that are responding to these prices. And when you have something that's this easy to understand, but so grossly out of step with what the actual incremental cost drivers are, it's only going to end in tears here. This is not sort of generating allocative efficiency. So next slide. Here, this is just looking at an emerging challenge, which is minimum demand and exports, which ultimately will also drive augmentation. If continue to export. And what we have right now is, and this is in one network where you can see minimum demand here is in the morning, because we're all asleep at 3 a.m. And you can see here on the structure that you've got off peak in the morning here. But if you turn to a network that's seeing a lot of solar concentration, like in SA Power Network's case, you can see that the minimum has really turned to the middle of the day. Now, if this is where most networks are going to be in the next few years, then telling everyone we've got peak demand here is probably, again, sending the wrong signal, leading to less efficient outcomes. So again, if we're going to, we cannot achieve the benefits that we showed in the previous cost benefit assessment without fixing these fundamental signals in the market. Right, now we're moving on to leveling the playing field. And so in this case, we're taking up the challenge of when we get to a specific network investment, and in this case, what's called the RIT-D, which is a regulatory mechanism whereby any asset that's valued at greater than 5 million for distribution networks must go through a process where there's a systematic and formal review to ensure that there's nothing that is lower cost. And what we've shown here, and I think this is through our own research. There's another version of this where we borrowed from work that either the AER or the AMC had done, but I think this is our work where we look at each of the networks, how many RIT-Ds they did in terms of the screening test, how many were found to be feasible non-network alternatives, and then how many actually got implemented. And you can see there was a whole lot of activity here that basically led to much fewer numbers of non-network alternatives being found. Now, I'm not saying it should be 100%. I don't really have a view as what the numbers should be, but at this level, it's not making a huge contribution. Now, when you dive into these numbers, most of the time it's because there's a finding of not insufficient available resources, or the cost of these resources is too high. And so one of the key questions here is, well, how did that price get determined, and how much signaling in advance was given, so and was it sufficient to allow for these resources to be developed in time? And so it could be just the way the process has been set up, that these resources have been ruled out because if they're not there right now and they take time to develop and they don't have that time in the system, then there's a little bit of a systematic institutional bias, I guess, that we believe should be looked at. Now, over this 13 to 17 period, and I will be the first to admit that this was a period during which we really only started to see solar. There was no storage. That of $24 billion of TNSP capex, about 350,000 of that went to non-network alternatives. So based on our review of best practice overseas, and also our understanding that we have of this particular system, we think there's a number of improvements that could be made to the system around transparency, around a holistic approach, and around data availability to the market, that we'll touch on in the next slide or two. Whoops. Oh, no, we're going there. Okay, so what is the right number? I don't know the answer to that question, but what I have found in the research that we've done in North America was that uh, the level of non-wires alternatives that may be potentially served by non-traditional solutions could possibly be higher. And what we're seeing here is the results of our research looking at RFPs, or requests for proposals, by utilities in North America as alternatives to traditional investments. So this is, also known as non-wires alternatives. And you can see here that there's a couple of different states, but the one that's dominant is New York. And it had a real peak in 2017 in terms of the number of projects that it went to market with. Now, a bunch of those were unsuccessful for the same reasons, not enough DER out there, or the pricing was too high, but they're already doing their due diligence and their lessons learned, and we do expect over time in their next round to have learned from that. And I think whoever is regulating this or interested in best practice, you should definitely have a look at what we've seen here in New York. Reach out to us after the presentation, and happy to point you in the right direction. So, Australia is not alone in this. I know in Europe and the UK that non-wires alternatives are increasingly being looked at. But best practices we've seen are achieving a much higher level of projects and successful projects on a pro rata basis. So the other leveling of the playing field that we wanted to bring attention to based on our research was different asset classes. Like there's only so many $5 million projects and distribution networks that come along, and by systematically focusing on those and those alone, it potentially doesn't put enough focus on other smaller asset classes, where on an individual size like a LV transformer is like 50 to 150,000 bucks, but there's so many of them, and so on a program basis, it's actually quite a valuable asset class. Now I know under the rules, all the DNSPs are required to achieve the capex and opex objectives, which include efficient investment. And so there is already a rule there that the DNSPs have to consider non-wires alternatives, or an efficient mix of behind the meter and network solutions. But it's hard and I know that there are networks out there that are doing that, in other work that we've done. But I would just raise to everyone's attention that there are significant amounts of capex going in that may be amenable to behind the meter resources. But maybe that there has just not been as much focus on these resources because it's harder. And that I think will be something we take up under the incentives. So two of the most important things I think around capability that we identified, one is something that in North America is called the Integrated Distribution Resource Plan, which looks a lot like a DAPR really, except for it's looking on a holistic basis over a period of years, and it doesn't just sort of focus on assets greater than 5 million. It's looking on a holistic integrated basis. How can each one of these constraints that we're seeing, whether it's voltage or it's reliability or whatever it is, what is the least cost combination of resources that could be deployed to meet the need? And by having a longer term view, it's easier to see on what the overall value of the market is, and that can encourage investment in service providers to enter the market and provide services rather than sort of piecemeal $5 million projects that may or may not emerge. So having the system plan is helpful not only to the network, but also those service providers that would potentially invest in entering this network. Now that's on a planning basis. On an actual operation basis, um, implementing of whether it's a DSO sort of architecture or something that's more just the ability to implement dynamic operating envelopes or any of the other sort of next generation technology that's out there, it's going to be really important. The networks have to be able to see what's on their network. They have to be able to interact and be able to send signals around dynamic operating envelopes. And ultimately, they are going to need to be able to send signals so that they can get virtual power plants to provide them with services like voltage control and or peak demand reduction or minimum demand mitigation. So it's important that the networks have the support and the capability to invest in these, and it's important that these get set up sooner rather than later, because they will be a barrier if not implemented. Right. So now we turn to the subject of the blog, and this is where we looked at the various ranges of incentives out there to encourage more investment, more management time and attention on making sure that the businesses are set up to take advantage of the least cost resource, and they know it's least cost because all the prices have been set correctly. And what we found was, and this was actually even a surprise to myself, having operated in this industry for a long time, was that the CESS, or the Capital Efficiency Sharing Scheme incentive, even when combined with the demand management, I can't remember what the acronym's called, but basically the incentive that's trying to address the deficiencies of, if you implement a non-wires alternative and it's OPEX, there's an additional loss there. And so combined, these two systems are supposed to provide a signal that's better than if you were to just make the traditional network investment. And what we found was actually they do succeed if you were to combine the two of them in providing a slightly higher incentive than just the payments to equity. However, the thing that we wanted to bring to everyone's attention is on an asset sale, which capitalizes not only the payments to equity, but also the payments to debt, which is related to the RAB, as well as all of the other value-added opportunities that a network business represents. It's still much lower. And so all we are really saying is if you're a successful investor, you tend to make investments in things that have relatively higher returns, and you will hire and incentivize your management to do things that are going to increase your investment. And under the current system, we haven't really set up a situation where implementing non-wires alternatives is providing that return to investors and network businesses. And that's something that were it to be the opposite, where you would earn double on making efficient investments in non-wires alternatives. I do think that we'd have slightly different behavior. In terms of where we got that multiple, it's based on our review of public domain information. These are the various RAB multiples that were provided in the public domain, and we basically use that to then calculate, after you spend $1 and you sold that business in that same day, what it would be worth in terms of a multiple compared to if you didn't invest that dollar or you invested it in a non-wise alternative, what the return would be. Now, I want to just emphasize that we think the important thing is that the returns are not lower, but rather the returns are aligned to what is most valuable to the consumer. I think that is pretty close. All right. Well, somehow we managed to bring that in about 30 minutes. So thank you.
Yep.
And I think
Ezra,
we're going
in
to
the
open it
chat
up
box,
to
we've marked
questions now.
12 questions. So if you can just click that question button in the chat box. All right.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay, so the first one comes from Rama at AMO, and it says, in terms of allocative efficiency, does analysis consider socialized cost of subsidies and other incentives? I would say off the bat that we haven't considered socialized costs of subsidies and other incentives. In the context of allocative efficiency, it's really what the marginal pricing signal, what the pricing signal is at the point of marginal consumption or investment. Now, to have a fully worked up marginal cost, then you would, in theory, also want to include socialized costs as well. And there's a whole issue around the impact of having prices not reflect costs, which lead to, I think, the cross subsidies that you're referring to here. And then there's a follow-up as well, which is the pricing focus on setting the peak price equal to LRMC a valid assumption anymore, given that D-network service is more than serving the peak in a highly decentralized power system? I think the principles of economics and of allocative efficiency sort of stand regardless of where you're looking to apply it. I think, and this is all, opinion. Economics has got maybe not quite the force that, let's say, engineering might. And if you build that bridge with, lower than the right levels of strength and it falls over, people just don't seem to put the same stock in following the economic principles. Having said that, and as somebody who's an economist, it's something that I guess we believe that over time, over the long run, that it's pretty important that prices be set equal to cost to have efficient outcomes. All right, so we got Anthony here. Thank you. We've got a question around human readable. I think that we removed in the access and pricing rule change. Well, you know what? You could be right there. I'm going to have to, well, I don't know if it's I'll just have to take a rain check on that, Anthony, and come back and thank you for bringing it to my attention that human readable or understandable is no longer in the pricing rules. I think that would be probably a good outcome given what we discussed. Terry, good to see you, Terry. You seem to focus on DER being defined as PV and behind the meter storage. Have you factored in the potential contribution of other controlled household appliances such as hot water, pools, filters, and EV chargers? Look, that's a really good point. I think behind the meter storage, certainly, I mean, I consider it like the chess piece because it can do so much, but because of electric vehicles, which is, basically a battery, but it's also a really big load when you're looking at level 2 at least. And there's a lot of flexibility there. And increasingly, we've always had hot water as well. And as a potential foil to voltage rise, it's quite powerful. So regardless, the pricing principles that we discussed and the need to get those prices right applies to any one of these resources. In our phase 1 project for Renew, we very much looked at all the different alternatives, and hot water was the least cost way of mitigating voltage rise after you did things like phase balancing. Tony, is there a written report on this project? Yes, there is, and that should be in the link that was sent out with the original blog. And if you don't have a copy of that, you should be able to find it under our news and reports, where you can get a link to that. If that fails, just reach out and we'll send it to you as well. And actually, if Victor can, maybe he can drop it in the chat, and then we get instant service. Okay, moving down, Rama, in the future of non-network alternatives, simply DNSP DERMS platforms is the future, is the future of non-network alternatives simply DNSP DERMS platforms and operational coordination with service providers, aggregators, and site-level DERMS. Incremental, one limitation at a time, feels a bit been there, done that. Do we not need something more fundamental to plan and facilitate distribution networks as an enabling platform? So I think I agree with everything you've said there. The one thing that I would like to point out about the way that the industry is looking at distributed markets and is that traditionally in market formation, you have to start with long-term contracts. And those long-term contracts in this case could be, hey, there's a constraint in 3 or 5 years. I'm going to contract with these service providers. They're going to put in more resources. And all of that works from a financial commercial perspective, but what actually happens over time is that we find that there is an excess or a deficit of actual resource capability, and so it creates these spot markets. And so traditionally, long-term contracts precede spot markets, but what we're seeing in the industry for the most part is everybody wants to jump to spot markets, and so I think the fixing of the planning function, doing more integrated distribution resource planning will help with that longer term contracting side of things. And then the distribution networks as an enabling platform is fundamental to the success. I mean, distribution networks are so important to efficient distributed energy resource integration and enabling a lower cost future and a more green future for everyone. John, hey John, re-access to stored behind the meter grid connected energy. Are you assuming 100% agree to guarantee access on demand from networks? We're not. So in the actual modeling we did for the report, we did assume that there was 100% availability of those resources to networks because we wanted to model what the potential benefits were given load and given wholesale market generation costs. And we wanted to look at that without any barriers. Now, the reality is getting folks to sign up for virtual power plants or providing access, there's a whole lot of work to be done there. And that's another sort of key barrier that we probably should have included, but one that we think is more market facing, and therefore there's not a lot to be done to fix it. We just need the incentives for new entrants to enter the market because they see a big market here because it's all been made transparent through 5 to 10 year integrated distribution resource plans. And without that potential incentive opportunity or incentive market opportunity, you're going to have lower levels of investment. Garth, hello, it's been a while. Thanks for your interest in the webinar. You say in the blog piece on network incentives. Yep. Analysis by the AER over the 13 to 17 period shown in the figure below found that networks spending just 35 million in not network options out of their 25 billion, 15%. May exclude is. I am unclear how this figure and conclusion was reached and what non-network capex it may exclude. Is what is being counted only those covered in the RIT Ds? So those figures were taken out of the figure that we presented earlier, which showed the total system capex. I think it's system capex, but I could be wrong there. And then it sort of funneled it down into different categories of operational expenditure. Because these aren't our numbers directly, and even if they were, I'm not sure that I'd know off the top of my head. But I will follow up after this and give you an explanation. Oh, we got another one from Garth. The AER's most recent State of the Energy Market Report, figure 3.2 on page 155, would suggest a level of non-network expenditure for electricity distribution networks that is multiples of this. 71. Wow. Okay, well, thank you for that. I'm gonna have to explore that with interest. That is a huge difference. So always thought-provoking contribution, Scar. Thank you. What, in your view, is needed? Okay, so Rama, what in your view is needed here in addition to the AER's value of DER methodology to move towards integrated resource planning here? I mean, I think a lot of what is needed is already in train, and I believe that in a more recent review, expanding on the DAPRs to be more like an integrated distribution resource plan is heading us in that direction, because it will provide more transparency. It forces the businesses to undertake the work, and it allows for consistency across the businesses. But mostly, I think that the networks need to have better incentives. And I'm not saying to cut other incentives. I'm just saying it's harder, it's riskier, and people just generally, regardless of whether they work in networks, I know anybody on this call, if you have a choice between two things and one is harder and riskier, you're in generally going to want to have a much a much greater incentive to take that course than the tried and true traditional methodology. Tony, I feel like this is an endless scroll here, but good questions, great questions. So Tony said, on LV substations, you are working at a very granular level with small number of customers, say 75 customers a feeder, 4 LV feeders and a 630 kVA transformer. Increasing transformers to 100, yeah. So transformers only come in certain sizes, and you are dealing with a more limited customer base. So there's all kinds of challenges. I think what could be helpful here, though, is if you have an existing transformer, and let's say that people have just putting on way too much solar, and so you're going to have to upgrade that transformer. The ability to not have to upgrade that transformer is the cost savings, I guess, as a use case that we would be describing here. So rather than, and also when you're talking about whole new developments, new connections, to the extent that the ADMD or even the maximum demand on the service wire or on the LV transformer can be brought down, so they don't have to be there in the first place. These are just examples of potential, and a lot of nobody's really doing this yet, but meeting peak demand for small periods of time, everybody knows that's expensive, and it's really just trying to ensure that we do the work and that we're ready for different mixes of solutions in the future. Kieran, hello. It's good to see you. Can you confirm that your calculation of the incentives for CapEx are predicated on the assumption that the observed transaction RAB multiples of C1.4 mean that the extra dollar of a RAB is 1.4 of enterprise value? I think that is correct. I think I'm going to get a follow-up on that one, though. Fundamentally, you take what is on the balance sheet and you multiply it by what was paid for that in the market. So I think that's yes. Tony, for the NV calculations, what discount rate is used for utilities and what discount rate for DER? That's a good question. I think from memory, for the utilities, it's more like a 6% whack. For consumers, right, for their discount rates, if they're the investors. Now, DER doesn't necessarily have to be invested by consumers, but if we were to use a consumer, it would be something comparable to a credit card. So 10%, let's say, and that's a pretty good credit card. Rama, DMI, thank you. DMIS is Demand Management Incentive Scheme. There is the Innovation Allowance as well. That's the DMIA. Thanks, Eric, for dropping the link into the chat. Stuart, boy, I'm just seeing if only we could do this in person. Be great to see everybody. Stuart, don't the RAB multiples represent a business's range of opportunities? Look, that is very true. It does. You have the opportunity to do unregulated businesses. You've got an opportunity to bring in a lower cost of debt. There's a whole bunch of opportunities that built into the RAB. But so it's not that DER is going to the issue I'm trying to raise is by at the moment pursuing DER alternatives reduces that RAB multiple, and unless the investors change how they value these businesses, it's going to lower the value of the business. And I think that's a conflict that's not in the best interest of the network, certainly, or the rest of the industry. And I'm not saying I've got a solution either. I think in New York they looked about capitalizing on other things like market services, just highlighting that it is an issue and that it's not been solved yet. Rob, thank you for the additional definitions. Question, a lot of suppliers of non-wires alternatives will be energy service providers and energy users, and getting them to find and supply non-wires alternatives will dramatically drop costs and increase volume. These suppliers have to negotiate with DNSPs for fair payment, but DNSPs are regional monopsonies. How do we create a genuine and efficient market for non-wires alternatives? I don't know that anybody's cracked it. I think New York's come the closest, and I think it's some combination of the regulatory environment and we all know, since the REV, there's been a lot of focus there, and what's right for Australia is going to be different than what's right for New York. But I guess one of the things I really enjoyed about this project was identifying, and this is all simulation and built up of assumptions, but the future, you don't have much choice. That there is a lot to play for is what we found, and so I'm hoping that policymakers, regulators, the DNSPs, the whole industry comes together and keeps trying, chipping away at doing this. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you. Andy, doing RFPs is a very antiquated and costly way of looking for alternatives. Have you seen better models? It's really interesting. I was doing a project for a business, and the actual scope of the project was tell us how to buy DER better, because they had just gone out for an RFP and they had all kinds of challenges there. And so when we did that work, and that included looking at how things are being done across the U.S. What we found was everybody was pretty much doing it like the standard old RFP. We're not going to tell you hardly anything. We're going to give you very little information, and then we want something back. And you can compare that with other approaches like alliance contracting, which is something that I was a part of when I was at Allsgrid, where you recognize unlocking all this value is high risk. We've never done it before, and so a different contracting method was used in that case. Now, I'm not saying alliance contracting is the right answer here, but it might be that instead of doing sort of piecemeal project RFPs, do you actually RFP for an aggregator on your network for the next 5 years or something, and work together to achieve the best possible deployment here. I do think that being more transparent about the size of the market, or at least your estimate of it, and more transparent about the value, and more transparent about what sort of loads are out there for folks that work in behind the meter space, is more likely to get us to a better outcome than very piecemeal, very limited amounts of data. Now, there's a great report, and I'll have to, I wish I actually had it at hand, that the New York DNSPs produced. And this was, looking back at that experience that I showed you in the graphic and saying what worked, what didn't, and what are we going to do moving forward. And one of the key things that they highlighted was the need to share more information with the market, that if you want more better responses, that you've got to be more transparent with what's behind the meter, and you need to get that information more in advance so that there's time to respond to it. Okay, Steve, can you please comment on the following? DERS as non-wires alternatives used to be touted as being quick to deploy, but now best practice reports, as you indicated, suggest that non-wires alternatives need considerable lead times. I personally think that short lead times are a unique strength of DERS, so should we not undermine that just because new non-wires alternatives providers can't scale quickly enough? So one of the nice things about non-wires alternatives is that you don't have to add big licks of capital. You can really, in theory, and this is a lot harder in practice, sort of follow the load over time. I think what does take time, especially in the beginning, is ramping up and mobilizing and spinning up. Like once you've got more of, to the extent that those investments can be made and everybody has good analysis of the system. And in some markets you've got published, and actually increasingly in Australia, you've got good visibility of all the distribution networks. What is their rating? What is their peak demand growth? And so you could be better prepared to deploy. You'd have your offer. You've had all your DER service providers. So I think in the near term, as we're trying to create this market, it's taking more lead time is needed. But actually, once all of those things are in place, I would expect that you can actually deploy the stuff relatively quickly, because you've got the right offers. You've got the right offers. You've got the right channels to market, etc. Kieran, Garth. Okay, I'll just leave that alone. Okay, we're at the final question at the moment, which is from Tony, which is, in the UK, they are experimenting with flexibility markets down to LV level where utility bids for demand reduction. It compares that with alternative traditional investments. This is easier than an RFP. So the issue with having short-term markets, it's great for those that have already made the investment. And how do you, more optimally decide between whether I want to reduce my bill that day or provide this service to the network? It's not as good with the investments needed to build more capacity that's in advance of what's going to happen based on tariffs, right? I mean, this is one of the key challenges here. The amount of solar and storage we have in the market at the moment is almost 100% a reflection of tariffs. And we talked earlier about the challenges with the tariffs in terms of, are those the right prices? Are those the right time periods? And so tapping into them through this what sounds like a very short-term bidding system is, I think that's fine for allocating existing sort of short-run marginal decisions, but in terms of enticing the right sort of investments, to me that's more of a planning thing. All right, well, wow. Thank you so much for all of these great questions, for being here today. We will be sending out the webinar. I think I owe Garth a follow-up, and again, looking forward to future discussions. And thank you, and take care. Bye-bye.